New Year's dinner was on the table, steam rising from the roast, and for the first time in years I thought I might feel peace again. My wife is gone, my world smaller than it used to be, but I told myself tonight would be a clean start. I was a fool because the moment my son Ethan stepped through the door, I knew something was about to break. He wouldn't take off his coat. He wouldn't look me in the eyes. His shoulders shook like he had been rehearsing a confession all the way from his car. When he finally sat down, my hand slipped, the pan crashed onto the stove, and he flinched so hard you'd think I had aimed a gun at him. That was the moment I understood this wasn't just a mistake. This was something that could ruin a family. I asked him what was wrong. He swallowed, stared at the table, and told me he had done something with my retirement fund. The money I saved across 35 years of working in the cold and the heat. In every season, a man's body can break. But what he did wasn't the part that froze my blood. It was who he did it for, and the message that came to his phone before he could finish the confession. The pan slipped from my hand and hit the stovetop with a sharp clang. It was a small mistake, the kind a man my age makes when his grip isn't what it used to be. But the sound cracked through the kitchen like something breaking open. I steadied myself against the counter, feeling the vibration run up my arm. The house stayed still around me, the hum of the oven, the low thump of the furnace in the basement, the tick of the old wall clock in the living room. Everything familiar, yet nothing comforting. The roast had been cooking for hours the way Emily used to do it, slow enough that the whole house felt warmer even in a Midwestern winter that cut straight through bone. Potatoes steamed in a shallow bowl near the sink. Green beans rested under a thin sheen of butter. The smell was exactly right. It should have brought peace. Instead, it reminded me of a chair that had been empty for 6 years. Her apron was still hanging on the back of the pantry door. I had kept it there out of habit, maybe out of fear, that taking it down would make her absence real in a way I still was not ready for. Sometimes when I cooked on nights like this, I caught myself looking at it as if she might walk in and tie it around her waist again. I set 2 plates on the oak table I had polished the night before. My hands lingered on the wood a moment longer than necessary. The third chair stayed pushed in against the wall. It was easier that way. Headlights swept across the window, followed by the slow grind of tires on ice. I waited for the sound of a child's boots on the porch, the small laugh that always came before the knock. But only one set of steps approached. Heavier, slower. The door opened with a soft click. Cold air crept into the hall. Ethan stepped inside, shoulders hunched against the wind, his face pale under the porch light. He shut the door gently, almost carefully, as if any loud sound might push the evening over an edge. It was already leaning toward. He gave me a small nod. "Hey, Dad." His voice carried the weight of someone who had rehearsed something difficult the whole drive over. He hung his coat on my hook instead of his own. That small shift made the hallway feel tilted. "Lisa and the boy stayed with her parents tonight," he said without meeting my eyes. "Thought it would be better if it was just us." Better, a word with too many meanings. I motioned toward the kitchen. "Dinner is ready." He followed me in, moving like a man walking into a room where he expected judgment. Under the warm light, I noticed the dark circles beneath his eyes, the way his hands stayed clenched even when he sat down. He left his boots on. That told me more than anything. I brought the roast to the table. Steam rose in gentle waves, carrying that familiar smell that used to make the whole family drift toward the kitchen. I served him as if nothing had shifted, as if the night could still be saved by routine. But he didn't pick up his fork. He watched my hands instead. "Dad," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something before it's too late." The fork paused in my hand. The room felt suddenly narrower. The clock in the next room kept ticking steady and patient, as if marking time for us both. too late for what I asked. He took a long breath, the kind that scrapes its way into a man's lungs when he knows he is about to disappoint the person he fears disappointing most. "I used your retirement fund," he said, "not part of it. Enough. More than enough. The money is gone." The words didn't strike like a blow. They settled instead, heavy and cold, filling the quiet. 35 years of work, 35 winters and summers, every pour, every bridge, every long shift. I felt all of it pressing against my ribs. I set the fork down slowly, and now the company folded, the man behind it vanished. I thought I could fix it before you ever noticed. But every time I tried to patch one hole, another opened. I kept thinking I could still make it right. He stopped talking, jaw tight. I could see the boy he used to be in the way his shoulders folded inward as if bracing for punishment. Before I could speak, my phone buzzed on the counter. A single vibration. Nothing urgent unless you knew how fragile the moment was. I walked over and picked it up. The bank app was already glowing on the screen. Fraud alert. Withdrawal approved. Timestamped just moments ago. I felt something cold move through me. Not anger, not shock. Something deeper. Ethan was here, both hands empty. Whatever was happening to my account was still happening, and it was happening now. I set the phone down beside the sink. The screen dimmed until it went black, leaving only my reflection in the glass. When I returned to the table, Ethan was watching me like a man waiting for a verdict. The roast cooled between us. The potatoes lost their steam. The smell of dinner, once warm and full, seemed to flatten into the air. "There is more to this," I said. He lowered his eyes, and in that small movement I understood something had shifted in our lives. Something that would not return to the way it was. The house grew quiet again. The furnace hummed. The clock ticked. I let my hands rest on the edge of the table. Across from me, my son sat in the soft yellow light, looking both like the man he had become and the boy I once carried on my shoulders. I looked at him and then at the chair where his mother used to sit and felt the room hold its breath as everything familiar slipped just a little farther away. The furnace clicked back on behind us, a low breath moving through the vents, and the sound seemed to press gently against the quiet sitting between me and Ethan. He kept his eyes on the table while I let mine settle on the soft circle of light cast across the wood. The scratches and marks from years of use glowed faintly under it, each one a reminder of a time when dinners like this were filled with easier words. My back tightened when I shifted. It happened more often now, and always carried the echo of a younger man walking steel girders in the winter wind. I worked through so many seasons that I could almost tell the year by the ache in my spine. Cold mornings on job sites, air so heavy in summer I could taste the metal dust on my tongue. Every shift added something to my body, and every paycheck took something from it. That was the trade. I never imagined the weight of all those years would settle into a single night at my own kitchen table. After Emily passed, the house began to feel like a space I was borrowing rather than a place I belonged. I moved through rooms quietly as if she might come back and find things out of place. Ethan came around often in those first months. He would stop by after work, loosen his tie, and sit with me in the living room while the evening news filled the room with voices we didn't really listen to. He ran errands for me without being asked, paid a few bills online. When I handed him the login to my accounts, it felt natural, almost necessary. A simple act of trust between two men trying to keep a family from slipping further apart. I watched him now, the way his shoulders sagged forward, the dark smudges under his eyes. He looked like he had been running on too little sleep and too much worry. I wondered how long he had been carrying the weight of this mistake, whether it had crept into his marriage as well. I had heard a strain in his voice the last time he spoke about Lisa, but I had not asked. People sometimes break quietly before they break loud. Memory drifted in without warning. The afternoon he asked me for help to start that business. He stood in the doorway, sunlight behind him, hands in his pockets, like he wasn't sure he deserved to be hopeful. I told him no. Told him the world was too uncertain, that risks like that could swallow a man whole. What I did not tell him was that I feared repeating the same mistakes my own father made. I did not tell him that losing Emily had made the idea of losing anything else unbearable. He heard something else entirely. A man hears only the weight of the door closing, not the reasons behind it. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, his fingers trembling slightly. I recognized that motion. He did it as a boy when he was bracing for my disappointment. I had always tried to be firm, not unkind, but fatherhood does not always translate the way a man intends. I let my gaze drift to the fridge. The photo of him and his son bundled up in the yard was held there by an old magnet shaped like a wrench. The boy was laughing, head thrown back, cheeks flushed red from cold. Ethan had one hand on his shoulder, steadying him. There was nothing in that picture that matched the man sitting across from me now. The roast had gone quiet on the table, its warmth thinning in the cool kitchen air. I could still smell it, a scent that should have brought comfort but instead pressed against the walls like a reminder of how quickly a tradition can lose its shape. I spoke softly. "You should have come to me before all this." He let out a breath, slow and uneven. His head lifted just enough for me to see the regret in his eyes. It was raw, the kind that does not look for forgiveness, only a place to set itself down. I didn't know how he said, voice barely above a whisper. The truth in his tone made the room feel smaller. I felt the years between us stretch out and fold back in again. All the conversations we had avoided, the silences we both mistook for understanding. I wondered if a single moment of honesty years ago might have kept us from this table, this night, this loss. "You've had a lot on your shoulders," I said, and it was not a question. His lips tightened. "Work has been rough. Money's been tight. Things with Lisa, they haven't been easy. I thought I could fix at least one part of my life before everything else fell apart." It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't an excuse. It was the truth he had been trying not to face. I leaned back, the chair creaking under me. The ache in my lower back pulsed once, reminding me of everything I had carried for my family and everything I had failed to carry well enough. A father can build a life out of sweat and bone, yet still lose the thread that ties him to his own child. Ethan looked up again. There was fear in his expression, but also a quiet plea, something that reached out and hesitated in the air between us. The furnace turned off and the house settled into a deeper silence. The light above the table flickered once, as if the room itself was unsure how to hold what had just passed through it. My eyes drifted toward the empty chair at the end of the table, the one I could never bring myself to move. For a moment I could almost see Emily there, hands folded, watching us the way she used to when she sensed something heavy brewing between me and our son. She would have said something gentle. She always knew how to guide us back to each other without making either of us feel small. But the chair stayed empty, the room stayed still, and whatever was going to happen next would have to come from the two of us alone. I kept my gaze on that chair as the quiet settled in again, soft and steady like dust drifting through evening light. The house held its breath. The furnace had gone quiet again, leaving only the soft ticking of the clock in the living room and the faint settling of the walls as the night pressed against them. Ethan sat forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles looked bloodless. I stayed still, letting the scent stretch just enough for him to feel its weight. He cleared his throat once, a small sound that disappeared into the room as soon as it left him. The overhead light caught the trembling in his fingers. When he finally spoke, his voice came out thin. "I thought it was a real opportunity." His eyes stayed down, fixed on some point between his boots and the table leg. I let him continue, even though every word seemed to scrape at him. "Lisa's friend knew a guy," he said. A startup something in logistics tech. They said it was growing fast, said we could double the investment in a year. They made it sound like everyone else was already in. He rubbed his hands together, a nervous motion as if trying to warm them or erase something from his skin. For a while, the reports looked good, he said. Numbers going up, updates from their office, or what I thought was their office. Then the emails slowed. The phone stopped being answered. By the time I realized something was wrong, the money was gone. All of it. A quiet throb rose behind my ribs, but I kept my face steady. The chair under me creaked as I leaned back slightly. I asked him who he had been dealing with. The question came out low, steady, the way a man speaks when he already expects the truth to hurt. Ethan hesitated. His shoulders pulled tight. His breathing shifted, shallow and uneven. It was the look of someone measuring the cost of speaking against the key of staying silent. Before he could form a word, his phone vibrated on the table. A short, sharp buzz that cut through the room like a blade. He flinched, almost recoiling from the sound. He picked it up with stiff fingers. The screen lit his face with a cold glow. His eyes flicked over the message, and something in his expression collapsed inward as if someone had taken the air out of him. He turned the phone so I could see. The message was short. "Do not say another word. Think about your son." My stomach tightened. My pulse thudded once deep and heavy. The boy was 4, small enough that he still needed help with his coat zipper. Small enough that the world should not have claws in him yet. I watched Ethan's face. The defeat in his posture shifted into something closer to fear, real fear, the kind that reaches into the bones. I asked quietly, "Who is threatening you?" He shook his head almost immediately. Not in refusal, but in something closer to panic. His mouth opened, but no sound came. The silence around us thickened, settling over the table, and the cooling dinner settling over that empty chair where Emily used to sit. Ethan's breath hitched. He looked at me the way a man looks at someone he wants to trust, but can no longer shield from the truth. I leaned forward, keeping my voice level. "Has someone forced you into this?" He dropped his gaze. His jaw tightened. No answer came, but the absence of words was louder than anything he could have said. The house felt smaller in that moment. The kitchen walls seemed to close in, the shadows under the cabinets darker, the light above us too bright. It felt as though we were not alone in the room, as if the person behind that message were standing somewhere just out of sight, listening for any sound that might betray us. Ethan set his phone down slowly, as if afraid the act itself might trigger another warning. His hands shook when he pulled them back into his lap. His breathing had gone shallow again. I watched him for a long moment. Every instinct in me wanted to reach out, steady him, tell him the truth was the only path out of whatever corner he had backed into. But I had been a father long enough to know that fear, when it rooted itself deep, did not release easily. The clock ticked again, a single sound that passed through the room like a reminder that time was still moving. Even if we felt stuck in place, Ethan swallowed hard. His voice was barely audible when he spoke. "I never meant for any of this, Dad." His words trembled, not with guilt, but with something far more dangerous. A man can live with guilt. Fear is another thing entirely. I felt the truth settling over me, then slow and cold. This was no longer about a bad investment, no longer about a mistake he could repair with hard work or time. Someone had reached into my family with deliberate hands and closed their grip around the most vulnerable part of it. Ethan lifted his eyes to mine. They were wide, unfocused, searching for something solid in the room. Something that could hold him up. Outside wind slid across the siding of the house, a thin whisper against the window. The roast on the table had lost all its warmth. Even the light seemed dimmer, as if the room itself understood the shift in the air. I did not speak. I simply held his gaze, waiting for whatever came next. His breath caught once, as though he were about to say a name. But the moment passed and he looked away again, shoulders folding inward like a man bracing for an unseen blow. The chair beside me creaked softly when I shifted. The empty one at the end of the table stayed perfectly still, a quiet reminder of the things we had lost and the things we still stood to lose. I let the silence settle again, heavy and unmoving, and kept my eyes on the place where his hands trembled against his knee. A pair of headlights swept across the front window, pale beams sliding over the walls and then fading. A moment later, tires crunched on the icy driveway. The sound drew both our eyes toward the hallway, as if the night itself had decided what would happen next. Ethan straightened in his chair. His hands left his knees and folded together on the table as if he could hide their shaking that way. I felt my jaw tighten. I was not ready for another witness to walk into this room, but the world outside our walls did not care what we were ready for. The front door opened with a sharper click than when Ethan had come in. Cold air rushed down the hallway, carrying with it the faint scent of perfume and exhaust. Marissa appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, framed for a second by the softer light of the hall. Dark hair, pulled back coat still buttoned to her throat, phone in her hand. Her gaze moved quickly, taking in the table, the untouched plates, the cooled food. She looked at me first. "Is everything all right?" Her voice had that clipped edge she used when she was already annoyed. When she turned her head and saw Ethan, something hard flashed across her face. Irritation wrapped around worry. I spoke before he could. "We have a problem with my retirement money." The words landed flat on the wood between us. Marissa blinked once, then let out a short breath, more like a scoff than a sigh. She stepped fully into the kitchen, the heels of her boots tapping against the floor. "How much of a problem?" Her eyes were on Ethan now. He did not answer. His silence said enough. "All of it," I said. For a moment she went very still. Then her shoulders dropped the barest fraction, as if some part of her had expected this long before tonight. She looked back at me, and there was no softness in her expression. "You are not going to spend that much in the years you have left." The words were clean and cold. They slid into the space between us and sat there, ugly and honest. Ethan closed his eyes, like the sound of her sentence hurt him physically. I felt something deep in my chest shift, not a sharp anger, but a dull blow to whatever remained of my pride. Men like me do not talk about how old we are until someone else uses it as a number to do math with. I kept my voice level. That money was not just for me. Marissa shrugged slightly, a movement more with her eyebrows than her shoulders. She set her phone on the counter and started unbuttoning her coat. "We can talk about all this later," she said. "Right now we need to go. Carter has school in the morning. I do not want him up late wondering where his parents are." She turned toward the hallway and reached for the hook by the door. As she pulled her coat free, something slipped from the inside pocket and floated to the floor, a folded rectangle of white against the dark rug. She did not notice. Ethan did. His eyes followed it down, then snapped to mine. I bent slowly and picked it up. The paper was heavier than a normal bill, the way official documents always are. I unfolded it carefully, smoothing out the creases with my thumb. The heading at the top was familiar, the name of a large insurance company I had seen on commercials for years. My eyes moved down the page. I saw the policy number, the coverage amount, and then the section that made my fingers go cold. Insured Ethan Ellis, beneficiary Marissa Ellis, payment source, followed a line of numbers I recognized too well. The last 4 digits of my own checking account. I stood there for a heartbeat, the paper open in my hands, the kitchen light glaring off the ink. Ethan rose halfway from his chair, panic flickering across his face. "Dad," he said quickly, "I linked your account a while back for some online bills. It was supposed to be temporary." I must have forgotten to unlink it. His words stumbled over each other. He looked as if he wanted to reach for the paper and did not dare. I did not look at him yet. I let my eyes move over the lines again, slowly this time, feeling each one settle in me. Marissa stepped closer, finally seeing what I was holding. Her face tightened just a fraction, like someone caught in a beam of light. "You should not be going through our mail," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "This is not your mail," I answered. "That account is mine." Our gazes met then, and for a second I saw past the surface. Underneath the sharpness in her eyes there was something else. Not simple greed, not simple annoyance. A strain stretched tight like a wire that had been pulled for too long. She was afraid, but not of me. I lifted the page slightly. "You took out a policy on my son with my money." Ethan spoke before she could. "It was my idea to have life insurance," he said, "in case something happened." "I did not know about the payments coming from your account. I swear I did not." "I did." His voice cracked on the last word. Marissa glanced at him quickly, a flash of something like frustration crossing her features. "We needed coverage," she said. "With his job, with the hours, there are risks. It is normal to have insurance. Normal, I thought, to plan ahead for the worst. Less normal to tie the cost of that plan to a father who had never been told." My eyes drifted to the section with the payout amount. It was not small. Enough to clear debts. Enough to start over. Enough to make a bad man think he had leverage when he mentioned a grandson in a text message. I folded the paper once, then set it on the table between us. No one reached for it. "Who suggested this particular policy?" I asked. Marissa hesitated. It was barely a pause, but I caught it. "A contact through Ethan's work," she said. "Someone who understands financial planning. Work. Planning." The words hung there like loose wires. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. He would not meet my eyes now. The fear in him had shifted into something more complicated, tangled between guilt and a different kind of worry. I looked back and forth between the two of them. My son, his wife. For years I had thought of their house as a smaller, newer version of this one. A place where life was moving forward in a way mine no longer was. Now I saw something else. Pressure at every angle, debt, expectation, and in the middle my grandson asleep in a room filled with toys that might have cost more than I had ever spent on Christmas. Behind Marissa's composure I saw the outline of someone else. A voice behind the text message. A person who understood that fear for a child is the quickest way to make a parent obey. She picked up her phone from the counter, tapped the screen once, then set it back down. The movement was small, but her fingers were unsteady. "We should go," she said. "Carter gets restless when we are not home by his bedtime." Ethan stayed where he was. "Dad," he said quietly, "I did not take out that policy to hurt you. I was trying to protect them. I lost track of what was tied to what. I believed the part of him that spoke those words. I did not trust the world he had tried to navigate to get there." The furnace came on again, a low rumble in the background. The kitchen light hummed softly. On the table, the insurance document lay like a forgotten napkin, edges curling slightly. The black print stark against the white. For the first time it occurred to me that the danger circling my family was not only out there in some office or anonymous account. It had found its way into my own name, my own bank, into the paper folded on my own table. I watched Marissa pull her coat back on her movements, careful as if she were carrying something fragile and invisible. Ethan pushed his chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the floor. "I did not stop them. I did not tell them to sit back down. I only let my eyes rest on that sheet of paper lying between our plates in the warm light as the sound of their steps moved down the hall toward the door. The door closed with the soft thud that traveled down the hallway and bled into the kitchen. After that, the house went very still again. No engine starting yet, no tires rolling away, just a thin thread of winter air seeping in under the frame. I stood there a moment longer looking at the folded policy on the table. The letters had begun to blur a little, not from tears, just from age and the way a man's eyes get tired by evening. I picked the paper up and set it by the sink out of the way of the plates, then turned off the kitchen light. The living room took me in the way it always did, with its quieter shadows and softer lamps. Family pictures lined the walls, frames collected over decades, a mix of department store portraits and crooked school photos. Emily's smile looked back at me from half a dozen angles, always the same warmth captured and frozen in time. I heard Ethan's footsteps come back toward me, slower now. He stopped at the edge of the room, as if crossing from the kitchen into the living room meant committing to something heavier than he was sure he could carry. "Dad," he said, voice low. "Mom would have told you to throw me out." He was wrong about that, and we both knew it, but the way he said it told me more about how he saw himself than how he remembered her. I sat down in my old chair, the one by the lamp with the worn armrest, and nodded toward the couch. He lowered himself onto its shoulders, sinking into the cushions as if every bone in his body had decided it had done enough for one night. For a while we did not speak. The television was off. The only light came from the lamp behind me and the faint glow slipping in between the curtains. Dust moved lazily in the beam like slow snow suspended in the air. I could hear the furnace again, a tired heartbeat somewhere under the floor. Ethan broke the silence first. "If you want to call the police," he said, "you should. If you want to report me to the bank. I will not fight you." He said it calmly, but underneath the calm was an emptiness that made my chest feel tight. This was not courage. It was the voice of a man who believed every road ahead of him ended in a wall. I let that hang for a few seconds, then drew in a careful breath. "You think that is what your mother would want?" He looked up, surprised. His brow creased, unsure if I was accusing him or testing him. "She always said I had to learn the hard way," he said. "Maybe this is it." I looked at the photo on the mantel, the one of Emily and Ethan at his high school graduation. Her hand on his shoulder, his smile wide and uncertain, like he still could not believe he had made it that far. She had leaned over to me that day while they posed for the photographer and whispered that the world would try to turn him into someone he was not, and that I needed to remember who he was before it did. "Your mother believed you had a good heart," I said. "She worried you were too quick to listen to other people, but she never doubted that part." Ethan swallowed. His eyes glistened in the lamplight, but no tears fell. "She was wrong," he said. "Look where listening got me." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, fingers laced together. The posture reminded me of the nights he had waited for me to come home when he was younger, when he had done something he knew I would not like. Back then, the worst of it was a dent in the truck or a failed test. This was something else entirely. He spoke again, softer now. "After she died, I kept thinking you looked at me and saw someone who could not fill the space she left. Someone who would never be enough." The words hit me harder than I expected. I thought back over the years after Emily's funeral, the way I had moved through the days like a man underwater, how many times Ethan had called and I had let it ring once more than I should before picking up. I never said that I answered. "You did not have to," he replied. The truth in that settled between us like another person in the room. I remembered all the times I had meant to tell him I was proud of the man he was trying to be, that I knew he was doing his best with a young family and a world that asked too much. Somehow those words had always seemed less urgent than the bills, the errands, the quiet routines that filled my days. He looked toward the wall of photos. His gaze lingered on one where he was about 8 years old, missing front teeth, holding a fishing rod twice his height. I was standing behind him in that picture, both hands wrapped around his, teaching him how to cast. I kept hearing your voice, he said slowly, the one in my head, the one that said, real men do not fail. Real men provide. Real men do not ask for help. That voice did not sound the way I thought I sounded. It sounded harsher, clipped like the edge of my temper on the worst day. So when this chance came along, he continued, when someone told me there was a way to get ahead quick, to wipe out the debt, to give Lisa and Carter the life they wanted, to finally look like I had done something right, I did not think about risk. I thought about not having to see that disappointment in your face again. He let out a quiet laugh that had no humor in it. And now here we are. I sat back, feeling the fabric of the chair scratch lightly against my arms. My hands curled around the ends of the armrests. I had spent years thinking my silence was a kind of strength, that swallowing my own fear and pain would keep it from spilling onto my family. I did not realize the way silence can change its shape, can become a wall that those you love keep crashing into without knowing why. I looked over at him, at the man my son had become, and for the first time I saw not just his mistakes, but the ways mine had guided him toward them. You have made a mess, I said, my voice steady. But you are not the only one to blame for how you got here. He frowned slightly, not yet understanding. I should have told you more, I said, about the times I failed, about the chances I did not take because I was afraid, about the nights I sat in this same chair feeling like I had built a whole career and still did not know if any of it mattered. He watched me closely now, as if hearing a foreign language. I let you think strength meant never stumbling, I added. That was not fair to you. For the first time that night, something softened in his posture. His shoulders eased just a little. His hands unclasped and fell open on his knees. He spoke, and this time there was no distance in his voice. What do we do now, Dad? There it was, the question he should have asked months ago, the one he had been too ashamed and too afraid to say out loud. I did not have a simple answer. I only knew that if I left him alone in this, it would finish what it had started. We start by not letting whoever sent that message decide what happens to our family, I said. And we start by you telling me everything, no more secrets. He nodded slowly. The fear in his eyes did not vanish, but it shifted, making room for something else. Maybe trust, maybe just exhaustion. Either way, it was enough for now. The lamp beside me buzzed softly. The house creaked as the temperature dropped outside. In the frame over the television, Emily smiled, her same steady smile, watching over a version of us that did not exist anymore and yet somehow still did. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The room felt fragile, like a rebuilt bridge that had not been tested yet. I listened to the sound of our breathing, to the quiet, to the thin hum of the furnace far below us, and let my eyes rest on the photograph of my wife as the night settled deeper around the house. The lamplight made a soft halo on the glass of her photograph. Emily smiled out at us the way she had at his graduation, at birthdays, at all the smaller days in between, that I had not thought to treasure at the time. For a moment I let myself hold that image. Then I turned my eyes back to Ethan. All right, I said, start at the beginning. He sat forward again, elbows on his knees, palms rubbing together slowly as if he were trying to conjure the courage out of friction. The room felt close but not hostile, more like a place where walls had heard more truth than anyone inside them had wanted to admit. He drew in a breath. You remember the advisor you and Mom used to see, he said, from the old firm downtown. I waited. The name was already rising in the back of my mind, like something I had tried to leave underwater and felt now brushing against the surface. The one who used to come over for dinner sometimes, Ethan added. Say his name, I told him. He looked up at me, eyes full of that old fear and a newer shame. Andrew Kellerman, he said. The room did not shift, but something inside me did. The sound of the furnace sank away. The tick of the clock seemed suddenly too loud. For a second, I could see Kellerman standing in my kitchen again, younger. Then his suit a little too sharp for our old house, laughing over a beer after talking numbers at the table. He had known every inch of our financial life, every account, every plan. He had been there when we bought this house, when we set up the college fund we never got to use, when we opened the retirement account I was now told was empty. I felt my jaw tighten. Ethan watched my face carefully. He reached out a couple of years after Mom died, he said. Just a casual email at first. Said he had heard I was at the logistics firm, that he knew people there, that he could help me make smarter choices. He made it sound like he was doing me a favor. The words rolled over me like cold water. I remembered that first year after Emily was gone, how blurred everything had been. I could not recall seeing his name in my inbox, but grief tends to erase details that are not clearly marked as danger. Ethan continued, voice gaining a little steadiness as he slipped into the story. At first it was small things, he said. Suggestions on refinancing the house, adjusting the balance on a credit card. He talked about leverage, about how people like us did not need to stay trapped by old rules if we were willing to be bold. He gave a short, bitter laugh. Bold, he said. That was the word he used. I could hear Kellerman saying it, see the small, confident smile he always wore when he thought he sounded smarter than the rest of the room. Ethan looked down at his hands. When the startup went bad, he said, when I realized how deep I was in, I panicked. I told him. I thought he would tell me I was an idiot and walk away. Instead, he leaned in. He told me it was only a temporary imbalance, that we could move things around, smooth it out, buy time until the right deal came along. Move things around. I knew that language. It had always bothered Emily more than it bothered me. I liked seeing the numbers grow. She liked seeing where they came from. How did he know about my accounts, I asked, keeping my voice steady. Ethan hesitated. He knew you trusted him before he finally said. He said you had given him limited power of attorney back then for convenience. Said it would be easy to renew a version of that, especially since you had given me access to help with bills. He made it sound like we were just updating an old arrangement. Nothing serious. I searched my memory and felt a slow dread rise as I recalled the stack of papers he had brought over once years ago. While Emily made coffee and joked that the only thing more boring than financial forms was tax season, I had signed where he pointed, confident that she would read the fine print later if it mattered. Ethan went on. He said if I moved some of your funds into a more flexible account, he could generate returns that would cover the loss, and then some, he said, that you would never have to know because by the time you needed the money it would be back with interest. His throat tightened. I did not think about what would happen if he was lying, Ethan said. I just thought about not having to tell you I had lost what I already had. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees now too, mirroring his posture without meaning to. The armrest of my chair dug into my side. Every breath felt heavier. I asked him about your retirement specifically, Ethan added. He said it was underperforming, that with inflation with the market you were essentially losing money by letting it sit, that we could route some of it through his channels, let it work instead of idle. There were terms there that sounded like something Kellerman would say. He had always had a talent for making caution sound foolish and risk sound like common sense. I remembered Emily sitting across from him at our dining table years ago, her fingers tapping a quiet rhythm on the wood while he explained how safe everything was. Later that night she had told me she did not like the way he smiled when he talked about other clients. Too proud, too sure, I had brushed it off. I looked at Ethan. When did Mom talk to you about him, I asked. He rubbed his eyes with thumb and forefinger, then let his hand fall. Near the end, he said, when she was going through the files. She told me once that there were transactions she did not recognize. Small at first, fees that did not line up, transfers between accounts she thought were supposed to be separate. When she asked him about it, he brushed her off, told her it was internal routing, industry standard. She did not buy it. I remembered those evenings now. Nights when she came home late from the bank. Her face tired, her answers short. I had assumed it was the illness making everything heavier. I had not asked the questions I should have. She told me to be careful around him if he ever reached out to me. Ethan said. She said if something happened to her, I should make sure you went through every account with someone new, someone without history. His voice cracked a little. I guess I failed at that too, he said. My hands closed into fists on my knees, not at him, but at the realization of how neatly someone had stepped into the gaps left by grief and habit. Kellerman knew this family. He knew when we were weakest. He knew where the cracks in our trust already were. I looked back at Emily's picture, tried to remember if she had ever said the name out loud, with the kind of suspicion Ethan was describing. If she had, it had been drowned out by hospital visits and lab results and all the other things that consume a household when sickness moves in. You are not the only one he misled, I said quietly. Ethan shook his head. I still signed, he answered. I still allowed it. That was true. It also was not the whole truth. I could feel right and wrong wrestling inside me, not in the abstract, but in this small living room where a father and son sat under an old lamp surrounded by photographs that had no idea what had become of the people inside them. How long has he been involved? I asked. About a year, Ethan replied. Maybe a bit more. It started with advice, then he wanted AXA. Then there were documents that I did not fully understand. But he said they were standard. Every time I hesitated, he reminded me how much was at stake. The house, the debts, Carter. He always brought it back to Carter. The message on his phone echoed in my mind. Think about your son. I saw it now, the pattern. A man like Kellerman did not need to shout to be dangerous. He found the fear that already lived in a person and pressed his thumb there slowly, steadily, until that fear did the work for him. Anger flickered in my chest, but it did not land on Ethan. It traveled further back to every handshake I had shared with Kellerman. Every night I had let him into this house. Every joke we had swapped over ribs and beer while he assured me he was looking out for our future. I should have listened more closely to Emily. I should have watched the way her eyes narrowed when he spoke. I should have asked why she was spending so much time with the files, near the end bent over the kitchen table with a pen in her hand. While the rest of us tried to act normal. The lamp hummed softly, the furnace grumbled and then quieted again. Somewhere in the house the wood creaked as it settled into the deeper cold of the night. Ethan watched me, waiting for a verdict only I could not yet give. I think I need to see him, I said at last. Ethan's eyes widened. He will not like that, he said. I let out a breath. He has already taken enough, I answered. If he is behind this, he is going to look me in the eye when he tries to do it again. We fell silent after that. There were no more words to move around between us without breaking something fragile that had just begun to mend. My gaze moved back to the mantelpiece. Emily's photograph stood there, the frame slightly crooked, her eyes bright in a way that had outlived her body. I reached out and straightened the frame with 2 fingers, then let my hand fall back to my side as the room settled into a stillness that felt like the moment before a storm decides where to break. The frame settled back against the wall with a soft tap when I straightened it. Emily smiled out of the glass the same way she always had, calm and sure, like she trusted me to know what to do. I let my hand rest on the mantel a moment longer. feeling the faint grain of the wood under my fingers. Then I took it away. Morning came gray and flat, the kind of winter light that did not bother to brighten anything, just laid itself over the town like a thin sheet. I dressed without rushing, but every movement carried a purpose I had not felt in a long time. Wallet in my pocket, keys in my hand, a manila envelope tucked under my arm with printouts from the bank and notes from the call I had made to the lawyer before dawn. The drive into downtown was quiet. Salt-stained, the edges of the road cars moved slowly through patches of slush, and the sky pressed low on the old buildings. I knew this route well. Years ago, I had driven it with Emily to sit across from Kellerman as he talked us through projections and charts. Back then, I had looked forward to those meetings, believing I was doing what a responsible husband and father should do. His office building stood on a corner brick darkened by age and winters. The sign out front still carried the name of the firm in faded letters, though most of the windows on the upper floors were dark. Inside, the lobby smelled of dust and old carpet cleaner. A directory on the wall listed several businesses, half of them with paper taped over their names. Kellerman Financial still sat there on the third-floor line. The elevator groaned on its way up. I watched my reflection in the metal doors, the lines in my face deeper than when I had stood there last. The doors opened to a hallway that buzzed faintly under fluorescent lights. At the end, his office door waited, the frosted glass panel bearing his name and a phone number. I knocked once and then turned the handle. It was unlocked. The room looked smaller than I remembered. The same framed certificates hung behind his desk, their gold seals dulled. A row of filing cabinets lined one wall, their paint chipped at the edges. A potted plant sat half alive in the corner. Kellerman stood when he saw me, smoothing his tie with one quick motion. "Thomas," he said, letting my name stretch into a shape that sounded almost friendly. "It has been a long time." He came around the desk with his hand extended. I looked at it, then at him, and moved just far enough into the room to let the door close behind me. "We have something to discuss," I said. He let his hand fall without losing the small, polite smile. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Of course," he said. "Please sit." I did not sit. I stepped closer to the desk and set the envelope down on the polished surface between us. He glanced at it, then back at me, his expression slipping into the attentive, neutral look of a professional hearing a complaint. "This about your accounts?" he asked. I held his gaze. "You know it is," I said. He eased back a little, resting one hand on the back of his chair. "I am sorry if there has been confusion," he said. "Markets have been volatile. There have been losses. It is unfortunate, but not unexpected in the current climate." I did not blink. "The confusion is not mine," I answered, "and this is more than market loss." I opened the envelope, pulled out the statements, and spread them slowly on his desk. Transfers, withdrawals, authorizations that never should have existed. His eyes flicked down to the pages. If he was surprised, he hid it well. "Some adjustments had to be made to protect your long-term position," he said. "Reallocations, short-term liquidity moves. These things can look drastic if you are not familiar with how they function." I thought of Ethan sitting in my living room explaining the way this man had approached him. Bold, he had said, that was the word. Now in this office, the word tasted different. I leaned in slightly. "You moved money without my knowledge," I said. "You involved my son. You tied my name and his to accounts we never agreed to. You made my retirement into your leverage." For the first time, his smile faltered. Only for a heartbeat, but I saw it. A small tightening at the corners of his mouth, a flicker in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by a thin patience. "Your son came to me," he said. He was under considerable strain. I offered solutions. Everything was above board. Above board, I repeated. Does above board usually require anonymous messages telling a man to think about his child before he talks? His eyes narrowed just slightly. The room, already quiet, seemed to lose another layer of sound. If Ethan is sharing his personal communications, he said, then he is more reckless than I thought. There it was, not denial, not shock, just irritation that his pressure had been named. I straightened up. My back ached, but I kept my shoulders square. Emily had questions too, I said. Her name moved across the desk like a gust of colder air. Kellerman's jaw tightened. He looked past me for an instant toward the bookshelf as if hoping to find a different subject there. She was always anxious about the details, he said. It is unfortunate she spent so much of her last years worrying over paperwork. I stepped closer again. She did not worry over nothing, I said. She saw transfers she did not recognize, fees that did not make sense. She told our son to be careful if you ever contacted him. She saw something in your work that she did not trust. His eyes came back to mine, and this time they held a different kind of sharpness. Some people, he said slowly, do not know when to let professionals handle things. They ask questions they are not equipped to understand. That can cause problems. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. There was no open threat in his words, but something underneath them made my skin feel too tight. You saying she was a problem? I asked. He shrugged one shoulder. It can be dangerous to pry into matters beyond your depth, he said. For anyone. The office felt smaller again. The hum of the fluorescent lights took on a higher pitch. I thought of Emily at the kitchen table with her stack of statements of the nights she had rubbed her temples and told me she was tired of the way she had tried to bring something up once, and then changed her mind when she saw how worn down I was. I gathered the papers into a neat stack and slid another document out of the envelope. The letter from my lawyer bore the letterhead of a firm that meant something in this town, and I watched his eyes as they passed over it. This is a notice, I said, from my attorney. Reports have already been filed with the bank. There will be an internal review and likely more. They have copies of all of this, and they know your role. His lips pressed into a line. You are making a mistake, he said. Bringing lawyers into something like this can damage reputations even when no actual wrongdoing is found. I held his stare. The damage has already been done, I said. My concern now is making sure it does not continue, and making sure my son is not the only one who pays for what has happened. He spread his hands slightly. Your son signed off on every move, he said. He gave consent. I have documentation. If anyone is exposed here, it is him. Something hot flared in my chest, but I kept my voice even. You targeted him because he was vulnerable, I said. You leveraged his fear. You used my trust from years ago to keep him quiet now. That may not be illegal in your mind, but it is not something you will be able to explain away easily. For a moment, we just looked at each other. Two men with years behind them, different choices etched into their faces. His suit was crisp. His nails were clean. But there was a twitch at his temple now that had not been there when I came in. You think you are protecting him, he said, but you have no idea how deep he is in. Sometimes someone has to be left holding the bag. My hands curled into fists at my sides, then relaxed. I thought about hitting him once quick and hard, the way the younger version of me might have wanted to. Instead, I took a step back from the desk. I am not here to argue with you, I said. I am here to tell you the days of you moving things around with no one looking are over. The bank will be looking. The regulators will be looking. And if anything happens to my grandson or to my son after today, they will be looking at you first. He watched me weighing this. The air between us felt charged, not with the kind of energy that leads to shouting, but with the heavy, slow current that moves under old rivers. He said nothing. I turned and walked toward the door. The carpet under my boots muffled the sound, but I heard each step anyway. At the threshold, I paused and looked back once. He stood behind his desk again, one hand flat on the papers I had laid there as if pinning them down. His face was composed, but his eyes were too bright, too focused. Not a man under control, a man taking measure. I did not wait for him to speak. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The fluorescent light hummed above me. Someone down the corridor laughed in another office, the sound thin and distant. When I reached the elevator and pressed the button, my hand shook for the first time that morning. Not from fear of him exactly, from the weight of knowing that something long hidden was finally expiated, and that what came next would not be clean or simple. The doors closed softly in front of me. In the mirrored steel, I saw my own reflection, smaller now, a little blurred, carrying the shape of a man who had given up the illusion that the past could be left undisturbed. Outside on the street level, the air hit colder against my face. Traffic moved along the wet road. People hurried past with their heads down, their own problems tucked inside their coats. I stood there for a moment on the sidewalk, the envelope under my arm lighter than it had been before, and let the noise of the city wash over me as I began to understand that some shadows in my family's story were finally losing their place to the light. The cold air bit at my cheeks as I stood on the sidewalk, the sound of traffic sliding past on wet pavement. People moved around me with paper cups in their hands and scarves pulled up to their mouths, eyes fixed on their own errands. I stayed there a while, breathing in the winter. The envelope lighter under my arm, feeling like something behind me had closed that would not open in the same way again. In the days that followed, the world did not stop for what had happened in that office. The mail still came. The garbage truck still clanged its way down the street. The same neighbor still scraped ice from his windshield every morning at 6. But under the surface of my quiet routines, other things began to move. The bank called first. A woman from the fraud department spoke in a calm, measured voice, the kind you use with patience in a waiting room. She told me they were placing a temporary hold on my retirement accounts along with several linked profiles while they conducted a full internal review. No more withdrawals, no transfers, nothing going out, until they understood what had been done. I agreed. It felt strange telling someone they could freeze the only money I had put away for old age, but after what I had seen, the freeze felt less like a loss and more like a bandage. There were other calls, meetings with my lawyer in a small conference room that smelled of coffee and toner, papers laid out on polished wood, questions asked, answers given, signatures made with a pen that glided too smoothly. Somewhere behind all that, the system began to take note of Kellerman not as a trusted advisor in a suit, but as a name attached to irregular patterns and unexplained fees. Marissa was brought into it too. There were requests for statements about the insurance policy, about who suggested what, about whose idea it had been to link my account to theirs. She came to my house once during that time, stood on the porch with her coat pulled tight, eyes flat and tired. She did not ask to come in. "This is not good for any of us," she said. I told her that some things had gone too far to be good for anyone for a while. Ethan did not stand beside her that day. In the weeks after our long night in the living room, I watched him move through his life like a man lifting himself out of deep water. He slept some nights on my couch when things with Marissa grew loud, voices on the other end of the phone too sharp for a child to hear. Other nights he went back for Carter's sake. He was trying to leave a house that had once promised him a future and now mostly offered conditions. When he finally told her he was done, that he could not keep living under the same roof with fear and half-truths. He did it quietly, no shouting, no slammed doors. He packed a small bag, kissed his son on the head while the boy clung to his neck, then walked out to his car with nothing but what he could fit in the trunk. The rest would be sorted out later by lawyers and courts and time. He came to my place that night, dropped his bag by the door, and sat in my chair before I could tell him to take the couch. He looked around the living room at the old pictures and the worn rug, at the lamp with the warm circle of light on the floor. "I lost the house," he said. I told him the house was not what mattered. They signed papers about custody, joint on paper but stacked toward Marissa in practice, at least for a while. Ethan took what he could get without dragging his son through a war. He saw Carter on weekends and once during the week when the schedule allowed. I watched him drive away from my house on those Sundays with an empty booster seat in the back, his hand resting on it at every stop sign. Then one afternoon in early winter, when the ground was hard and the sky clear for the first time in weeks, the bank called again. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, listening as a man from another department cleared his throat and shuffled papers. In the review, he said they had gone through all accounts connected to my name and to Emily's. Old files, closed folders, things we had forgotten about. Buried in there, he said, was a small account opened years ago under a separate product, one of those rainy day instruments the bank used to push before the market changed. The sole beneficiary listed was Ethan. He read the balance. It was not a fortune, not compared to what had been lost, but it was not nothing either, enough to clear some of Ethan's most immediate debts, enough to put first and last month's rent on a modest apartment in a decent school district, enough to leave a little cushion so he would not be choosing between groceries and gas. I remembered Emily at the kitchen table, her hands moving through stacks of paper, her eyes counting what I could not see. She must have done it then, opened that quiet lifeline for him, planning for a storm she hoped would not come. After the call, I sat there alone for a long time, the mug cooling under my fingers, and let the weight of that settle into me. We set the account up for Ethan a few days later. He came to the bank with me, hands deep in his jacket pockets, posture caught between shame and gratitude. The teller processed the forms, spoke to us in the same polite tone she used with everyone unaware of the history sitting between us at her counter. Outside in the thin winter sun, he looked at the new card in his hand. "I do not deserve this," he said. I told him it was not about deserving. It was about someone who had loved him making sure he had a way forward when he needed it most. When the investigation into Kellerman moved beyond the bank, it did so without much noise. There were no scenes on the evening news, no handcuffs in front of cameras. Just a notice from my lawyer that the regulator had opened a case, that other clients had come forward with similar complaints, that there would be hearings and reviews, maybe charges, maybe settlements. For my part, there would be restitution, at least partial, eventually, in timelines measured by months and years. It did not feel like justice in the way movies sometimes show it. No one was dragged into a bright light to confess, but I slept better knowing he would not be as free to slide through other families' lives the way he had slid through mine. Time moved. Snow came and melted and came again. Christmas passed quietly, a smaller tree in the corner of the living room. One string of lights instead of 3. Ethan brought Carter over to help decorate. The boy hung all the ornaments on the same stretch of branches until the tree leaned and we pretended not to notice. On New Year's morning, a year after the dinner that had broken open our lives, I stood on the front porch with a mug of fresh coffee in my hands. The air was sharp, but not cruel. The sky was a pale blue, washed clean overnight. The street was almost empty. Most people were still inside, letting the new year come to them slowly. Ethan stepped out to join me, pulling his jacket tighter, breath showing in small clouds. Behind him, through the screen door, I could see Carter on the living room floor with a set of plastic trucks. The television muted a parade moving silently across the screen. We stood side by side, looking out at the quiet street. For a while, neither of us said anything. The stillness felt different from the silence of that old night in the kitchen. Less heavy, less sharp. I glanced at him. He had lines at the corners of his eyes now that had not been there a year before. There was tiredness in his face, and there was something else, too. A steadiness that comes when a man has finally stopped running from the hardest parts of himself. He spoke without looking at me. "I keep thinking about her," he said. "About Mom. About what she would say if she saw everything that has happened." I let the steam rise from my coffee, the warmth seeping into my fingers. "She would say you are still her boy," I answered, "and that she did not raise you to be perfect. She raised you to keep getting back up." He nodded once, jaw working. "I want to be the man she thought I could be," he said. "Not to prove anything to anyone, just because I'm tired of being afraid of my own mistakes." We stood there with that between us. The words did not fix what had been broken. They did not bring back what was gone. They did make the space between us feel less like a gap, and more like a road we were both willing to walk. In the living room, Carter let out a small laugh at something his trucks were doing. The sound floated out onto the porch light and unburdened. Ethan turned his head toward it, and his face softened in a way I had not seen since he was that age himself. I thought about the years ahead of me. They would not be many, not in the way they once were, stretched out like a long highway. But they felt enough to help my son build a life that did not stand on secrets. Enough to see my grandson grow old enough to remember me as more than a chair in the corner. The wind brushed past us, carrying the faint smell of snow from somewhere farther north. The old porch boards creaked under our weight. Inside, the clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the first minutes of another year. I lifted the mug to my lips, tasted the coffee warm and simple, and let my eyes rest on the quiet street. As the light shifted just slightly across the houses,